The phone rings. It's late, but the voice on the other end is frantic. A mother's voice, sharp, desperate, whispers into the receiver, "They're all dead. My family is dead, and he's gone. My son. He killed them." The voice breaks, as if struggling to hold on to the last thread of reality, but the words spill out like a nightmare, "He killed them all." In that instant, every detail of the story that will unfold over the next few hours begins to weave itself into a tapestry of confusion, shock, and disbelief. The kind of disbelief you feel when you hear something so horrifying. It feels as though your mind is struggling to accept it. Who would have done such a thing? Who would turn against their own flesh and blood? But it doesn't take long to realize that the story isn't as straightforward as it seems. It started like any other story. A family. A mother, a father, 2 children, and a woman who had been part of the household for years. They were ordinary, living ordinary lives, in a small house in a quiet neighborhood. Kevin Green, their son, had always been at the center of their world. To his parents, he was everything. And yet, there was something about him, something deep inside that no one could quite place. It was subtle at first. His relationship with his girlfriend, Emily, had always caused friction. But this was no ordinary tension. This wasn't the usual disapproval of a mother towards her son's choice in a partner. No, this went much deeper. Betty Green, Kevin's mother, had made it clear from the very beginning that Emily was not welcome in their lives. She criticized her, belittled her, and no matter how hard Kevin tried to make things work, he couldn't erase the cold judgment in his mother's eyes. It wasn't just an issue of incompatibility, it was as if Betty saw Emily as a threat. A threat to everything she had built, to the family she had spent years shaping and controlling. And as time went on, this underlying tension began to grow. Kevin tried to be the good son. He tried to maintain a balance, to keep the peace between his girlfriend and his mother. But there was no peace to be had. Emily, it seemed, would never be accepted by the one woman who mattered most to Kevin. But that was just the surface. Beneath the cracks, beneath the everyday arguments and strained conversations, a much darker reality was unfolding. A reality that Kevin couldn't, or wouldn't, escape. What was a mere disagreement, a family feud, slowly turned into a war. And in wars, there are casualties. The night before the tragedy, Kevin had been spending time with Emily at a nearby cafe. He had been agitated. She noticed the tension in his voice, the way his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his drink. She tried to console him, but Kevin was distant, his mind elsewhere. As they left, he promised her things would change, that they could finally move away, start fresh. That was the plan. But no one would know that those words were a lie. No one would ever know what had been said in the hours leading up to the night that would end in violence. The following evening, the phone call came. And that's when everything came crashing down. Police arrived at the Green household to find 4 bodies. Paul and Jennifer Green, their children, and their longtime housekeeper. All dead. The images from the crime scene, bloody, gruesome, shocking, would haunt anyone who saw them. But what was even more chilling was the absence of Kevin. Where was he? No one knew. Was he the killer? Was it someone else? The only thing the authorities could say for certain was that Kevin was missing. The questions piled up quickly. But with each piece of information that surfaced, the story only became more complex. The neighbors couldn't say much. They had heard arguing, but it wasn't unusual. What was unusual, though, was the complete lack of a struggle. The victims had been killed in their sleep. Each one methodically executed. And then, there was Kevin's story. When the police eventually found him, wandering, confused, and claiming amnesia, it became clear that something wasn't right. Kevin was the only survivor. Kevin was the only one left to answer for what had happened. But his story didn't match the evidence. In fact, it didn't even come close. His account was inconsistent, full of holes, full of contradictions. He told investigators he had no memory of the night, no recollection of what had happened in the hours leading up to the killings. But that didn't stop the questions from forming. How could a son do this? How could someone so close to his family carry out something so horrifying? The investigation led the authorities to a series of discoveries. Small things. Little things that didn't seem important at first but grew in significance as the pieces of the puzzle came together. A letter, found in Kevin's room, written to Emily. In it, he confessed his fear of what was happening between him and his mother. He said he couldn't take it anymore. But those words were just the beginning. Kevin was quickly arrested. But even then, the questions kept coming. How could he have done it? Was it a crime of passion, the result of years of resentment? Or was it something else? Something deeper? The details are still debated to this day. Some say it was a moment of rage, fueled by the pressure from his mother. Others argue that Kevin had planned it for months, waiting for the right moment to take control of his life, to end the suffocating hold his mother had over him. And still, others say that Kevin wasn't the real killer at all. But who, then? In the hours before the truth came out, before the courtroom drama unfolded, there was one question everyone kept asking: what drove Kevin to kill his entire family? But then, the investigation would uncover something that no one could have predicted. Something that would shock even the most hardened detectives on the case. And it all started with one chilling realization. That this story wasn't just about a son and his family, it was about a much deeper, darker secret that had been hidden for years. Something that no one could have seen coming. But the question remains: who was really behind the tragedy? Who was pulling the strings? And who, in the end, paid the price for it all? The answers will unfold slowly, piece by piece, in a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. The first breakthrough came when investigators were able to access Kevin's phone records. They uncovered a series of alarming text messages between him and his mother, Betty. In these exchanges, Betty had been relentlessly pressuring Kevin to end his relationship with Emily. The texts were filled with accusations, manipulative language, and, most unsettling of all, the clear indication that Betty had been controlling every aspect of Kevin's life. At first, it seemed like the usual overbearing parent dynamic, but as the texts piled up, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Kevin's responses, frustrated, angry, and, at times, pleading, painted a picture of a son suffocating under his mother's influence. She told him that Emily was nothing more than a distraction, a parasite, who would ruin him. She insisted that Emily was after his money, after his inheritance, after everything he had. Betty made it clear that if Kevin wanted to live up to his family's legacy, if he wanted to be successful and respected, he would have to sever ties with Emily. But what was perhaps the most chilling revelation wasn't just the intensity of Betty's controlling behavior. It was the language she used. The messages weren't just about disapproval, they were about control. She didn't simply want Kevin to end the relationship. She wanted him to cut Emily out of his life entirely, to forget her, to erase her as if she had never existed. There was something suffocating in the tone of her words, a demand so fierce, it felt as though she wanted to break him, to destroy everything that made him happy, to have him all to herself. As these messages came to light, investigators started to piece together a narrative of a family trapped in a web of manipulation, control, and emotional abuse. But the question still lingered: was this enough to explain what had happened? Kevin's defense was that he couldn't remember the events of that night. He insisted that he had blacked out after a heated argument with his mother, one that had escalated over Emily. But the evidence painted a different picture. Surveillance footage from a local convenience store showed Kevin, alone, walking down the street in the dead of night, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. He carried nothing but a small duffel bag, which, when opened, revealed a change of clothes and a blood-stained shirt. The time stamp on the footage matched the moment the murders had taken place. At first, investigators couldn't make sense of it. How could a young man, who had always been seen as mild-mannered, who had always been the dutiful son, commit such a horrific act? The autopsy reports revealed that the victims had been killed in their sleep, methodically, one by one. The murder weapon. A knife, a weapon that had been taken from the family's kitchen. But there was no sign of forced entry, no struggle. The murders were precise, calculated. It was as if the killer knew exactly what he was doing. The breakthrough came when the investigators examined the crime scene more closely. A family photo, tucked under the couch, seemed out of place. It was an old photograph, one that had been taken years earlier, long before Kevin had started dating Emily. But when they flipped the photo over, they found something written on the back, a cryptic message, scrawled in what looked like Kevin's handwriting: "She's right. I'll never be good enough for her. She's one. I'm sorry, Emily." The message didn't make sense. Who was Kevin apologizing to? And why had he written this, almost as though he had already been planning for what was to come? As the investigators delved deeper into Kevin's background, they discovered an unsettling truth. Kevin had been seeing a therapist for years, someone who had documented his troubled relationship with his mother. The therapist's notes revealed a young man trapped in a cycle of emotional abuse, someone who, despite his outward calm, was on the verge of breaking. Kevin had confessed during his sessions that he had felt powerless to escape his mother's grasp, that he had tried to please her, tried to be the son she wanted him to be, but every attempt had failed. And when Emily entered the picture, it only made things worse. His mother saw Emily as a threat, a distraction, something that stood between her and Kevin. But there was something more, a darker secret. As the investigation continued, it was revealed that Kevin had been subjected to years of manipulation, gaslighting, and emotional torment by his mother. Betty had made Kevin believe, over and over again, that he was weak, that he was incapable of making his own decisions, that he was nothing without her. She had made him question his worth, his abilities, his own judgment. In essence, she had conditioned him to believe that he was nothing without her guidance, without her control. It was only then, as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, that the investigators began to understand the full scope of the tragedy. Kevin had been emotionally broken. He had been trapped in a cage of his mother's making, and when that cage finally broke, when the pressure became too much to bear, it had all come crashing down. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom was filled with tension. Kevin's defense attorneys argued that he was not in control of his actions, that he had been the victim of years of abuse, and that he had been pushed to the edge by his mother's unrelenting control. They painted a picture of a young man who had been manipulated, who had been led to believe that his only escape from his mother's grip was through violence. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Kevin had made a choice. They argued that, despite the emotional abuse he had suffered, he was not a helpless victim. He had chosen to kill. He had chosen to end his family's lives. And the evidence, they claimed, pointed to premeditation. In the end, it was a battle of two narratives, the story of a son broken by his mother's cruelty and the story of a man who, in a moment of rage, chose to destroy everything he had ever known. As the verdict was read aloud in the courtroom, the weight of it hung in the air. Kevin Green was found guilty of the murders. He was sentenced to life in prison, though the debate over whether he had been truly responsible for his actions, whether he had been the victim of a mother who had controlled every aspect of his life, remained. But the tragedy didn't end with Kevin's conviction. The family, the community, and even the country were left with lingering questions. Was Kevin a victim of abuse? Or was he a killer who made a conscious decision to end his family's lives? And in the end, what price had they all paid for a toxic, suffocating bond that had slowly unraveled and led to such a horrific outcome? Kevin's story, his trial, his conviction, were they the end of the story? Or were they merely the beginning of an even deeper mystery, one that no one could fully understand? In the years following Kevin Green's conviction, the case never truly faded from the public's consciousness. The more people learned about the intricate details of the case, the more they found themselves questioning the motivations behind the tragedy. While some argued that Kevin was simply a victim of his mother's psychological manipulation, others wondered whether there was more to the story, a hidden layer of secrets that had yet to be uncovered. Kevin, now locked away in prison, remained silent for a long time. For months, he gave no interviews, no statements, refusing to speak about the crime that had shattered his family. The press, ever hungry for new angles, tried to pry the truth from him, but Kevin wouldn't budge. His lawyer advised him to keep quiet, as further revelations could complicate any attempts at an appeal. But even in his silence, questions lingered. And then, 3 years into his sentence, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived at the police station. It was addressed to Detective Sarah Mitchell, the lead investigator on Kevin's case. Detective Mitchell had been involved in the investigation from the very beginning, piecing together the evidence that ultimately led to Kevin's conviction. The letter, postmarked from Kevin's prison, was brief but chilling. "I didn't do it. Not the way they think. The truth is much darker than you know." Those words sent shockwaves through the authorities. After all this time, after the trial, the sentencing, the countless hours spent scrutinizing the case, Kevin was claiming that he hadn't killed his family in the way everyone believed. But what did he mean by that? Was he trying to protect someone else? Or was he finally revealing something that the investigation had missed? The letter had no signature, no other explanation, but it raised more questions than it answered. Detective Mitchell felt a mix of disbelief and curiosity, but there was one thing she knew for sure: she had to investigate this new lead. What if Kevin was telling the truth? What if, in the years since the trial, new information had surfaced that could change everything? She began reviewing the case files with renewed determination, re-examining every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every forensic detail. She had lived with the case for years, and now she was convinced that something had been overlooked. What had Kevin meant by his cryptic words? Had there been another force at play, something deeper than just a son lashing out at his overbearing mother? It was during this review that a strange detail caught her attention, an unnoticed piece of evidence buried deep within the forensic files. A hair. One single hair. It had been found in the family's living room, near the crime scene, but it had been dismissed as insignificant at the time. It didn't belong to anyone in the Green family, and DNA analysis showed it didn't match Kevin's either. But the hair's origin had never been fully explained, and it had been forgotten as the investigation pressed forward. Detective Mitchell, driven by a sense of urgency, ordered further testing. The results were nothing short of shocking. The hair belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who had never been mentioned in any of the original investigations: Emily's ex-boyfriend, Thomas Randall. At first, this discovery didn't seem to make much sense. Why would Emily's ex-boyfriend be involved in the Green family murders? But as Mitchell dug deeper into Thomas's background, a dark story began to unfold. Thomas Randall had a history of violent behavior. He had been arrested multiple times for assault, and his relationship with Emily had ended under suspicious circumstances. Emily had never spoken about him much, but her friends had described him as possessive and controlling. He had been obsessed with her, unable to let go after their breakup, and had allegedly made several threats toward her. But there was more. Thomas had once lived just a few blocks away from the Green family's house, and several neighbors recalled seeing him in the neighborhood on the night of the murders. He had been in the area, but no one had ever suspected his involvement. Detective Mitchell's suspicion grew stronger. What if Thomas had been in contact with Kevin? What if, after years of torment from his mother, Kevin had been manipulated into believing that killing his family was the only way to escape her grasp? And what if Thomas had been the one to drive Kevin to this breaking point, using his own manipulation, just as Betty had done for years? Mitchell began to interview people who knew Thomas Randall. What she uncovered was a chilling portrait of obsession. Thomas had been in contact with Kevin before the murders, though Kevin had never mentioned this to the police. He had been using the pretense of offering advice to Kevin, claiming that Betty Green was a toxic force in his life. In their conversations, Thomas had echoed many of the same sentiments that Kevin's mother had planted in his mind, encouraging him to cut ties with Emily, to sever his dependence on his family, to take control of his destiny. But the more Mitchell investigated, the more she began to suspect that Thomas wasn't just trying to manipulate Kevin into making decisions. He may have been actively planning the murders with him. What if Thomas Randall was the mastermind behind the entire event? What if, instead of being a victim of his mother's cruelty, Kevin had been manipulated by someone else, someone who had his own motives and used Kevin as a pawn in a far more dangerous game? Detective Mitchell continued to piece together the timeline. She found that, in the months leading up to the murders, Thomas had been steadily increasing his influence over Kevin. Through phone calls, messages, and even face-to-face meetings, Thomas had convinced Kevin that the only way to be free from his mother's control was to take drastic action. It wasn't just about killing Betty, Kevin's mother, it was about escaping the grip of the entire family. But what role did Emily play in all of this? Was she simply an innocent bystander, caught in the crossfire of a toxic relationship between Kevin and his family? Or was she, too, manipulated by Thomas in a way that no one had realized? As Mitchell uncovered more, it became clear that Emily's life had been more complicated than anyone had known. She had once confided in her closest friends about her fear of Thomas and his volatile temper. But Emily had never taken those threats seriously, not until the night of the murders, when she, too, became a victim in this twisted web of lies and manipulation. Eventually, Mitchell's investigation led to a chilling discovery: Thomas Randall had been living under a false identity. He had been using multiple aliases and had a network of contacts that extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. He was a master manipulator, hiding in plain sight, controlling the narrative in the background while everyone focused on Kevin. As the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place, Mitchell began to realize the truth: Kevin had been a victim all along. Not just of his mother, but of Thomas Randall. Kevin had been groomed by Thomas, led down a path of destruction, all in the name of escape. In the years that followed, Thomas Randall was arrested and charged with masterminding the murders of the Green family. Kevin, whose own conviction was later overturned in light of this new evidence, was freed. But the damage was done. The Green family was gone, and no amount of justice could bring them back. The case would haunt those involved for the rest of their lives, leaving everyone to wonder, how many lives could have been saved if someone had seen the signs earlier? How many victims had been manipulated by Thomas Randall, hidden in plain sight all along? In the end, the true horror of the story was not just the killings, it was the chilling realization that the most dangerous criminals are often the ones who can manipulate from the shadows, using words and emotions as weapons, and that the innocent sometimes bear the heaviest weight of all. The questions remain. And as the years go by, the haunting images of that night, of the crime scene, of the family photos, of the confession, continue to linger in the minds of those who followed the case, unable to let go of the chilling truth that a mother's love could go so terribly wrong. As the truth finally comes to light, the question remains: who can we trust, and how far can manipulation go before it destroys everything? This case isn't just a story about a tragic family. It's a stark reminder of how easily lives can be torn apart by those we least expect. What do you think? Was Kevin truly a victim of manipulation, or did he also have plans to murder his family? And how deep does Thomas Randall's influence really go? Leave your theories in the comments below, let's discuss. If you found this story as chilling and perplexing as we did, don't forget to like this video and share it with others. Make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on another haunting true crime story like this one.